we continue to look back on stories that grabbed headlines this past year, the African continent also experienced some significant events. William Ruto's election as Kenyan president came as a shock to many. He defeated Raila Odinga with a 50.49% of the vote. The peace pact between Tigrayan rebels and Ethiopian government also made headlines. Let's unpack this and more further with Advocate Sipho Mantula, who's a researcher at the Thabo Mbeki School of Public and International Affairs. Advocate Mantula, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. A lot to unpack about Africa, but of course we'll start with Kenya, with William Ruto now being elected as the president of Kenya, someone who played on his faith and humble beginnings of selling chickens on the side of the streets in Kenya. Also one of the richest men in that country, rocked with some corruption scandals behind him. He promises to take the Kenyans out of poverty and lead them to a brighter future. What's your take on his election?
Afternoon to your viewers and Jumbo Africa. Indeed, a very important year in the continent when you look at the elections. It was actually a tough year for Kenyans as they waited for those election results to come. It was between August and September, if you can recall. And those elections was a tie between him and Odinga. Odinga, who has tried more than twice to get into power. But like we have said, William Ruto was a vice president to Uhuru Kenyatta, and they fall apart at some point. So if you look at the Kenyan politics, it's the politics that elections either go either way, violence, or they go to the courts. So what we saw in Kenya, Nairobi, it was a repetition of 2017 in terms of presidential electoral disputes. And we saw how Odinga managed, failed to prove to the courts about irregularities. But the Kenyan elections also, I think it's a litmus test to the African continent, because the AU gave them the green light, but the EU raised concerns. So if you look at election patterns in the African continent, whether you look at Angola, Lesotho, that went through, the pattern is that you have observers, you've got election management bodies that have to manage elections, and that's how it will pan out. But again, like we've said, William Ruto surprised many, coming from humble beginnings and became the head of state.
Speaking about him being the deputy to Kenyatta, what was the fallout there? Because we know that he was a staunch supporter of Kenyatta in the terms that Kenyatta led Kenya.
No, one can look at their policy difference, but also coalition politics in Kenya, Nairobi. And the fallout also becomes when the issues of elections come 2021, when it was seen that it seems that Odinga and Uhuru Kenyatta, they have signed a pact already. So there was already an agreement between Odinga and Kenyatta to go for those elections as coalition. And Odinga opted to take another route as well. And that's where that fallout happens. And I think that's the nature of African politics, that the running mates or the vice presidents, they always feel that they are the incoming presidents. So naturally, that's how it happens, that they had to have this tension, and he won those elections.
Now, 2 weeks ago, Ruto met with the U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken on the sidelines of the U.S.-Africa Summit. And we know that there are some commercial trades between the two countries. How do you think that's going to impact in terms of Kenya playing a role in addressing some of the security issues within that region amongst northern Ethiopia, eastern DRC, Somalia, and South Sudan?
No, if you can look, Kenya has been playing a critical role in the crisis between Rwanda and DRC now, as we saw that William Ruto was able to push Uhuru Kenyatta as a mediator in that peace process. But also, being in that Washington summit, it was another fallout by African leaders that they rushed to Washington to deal with their own matters there. So, Katlago, if you look, Blinken there advised many African countries that are coming up, that are going for elections in 2023. They also look at the role of Kenya in terms of economy. And Kenya has already asked money from IMF. So economy of Kenya is bit struggling also. But they've went to IMF to borrow money. And also William Ruto agreeing with the East Africa community to intervene in the conflict that is in the DRC. So you can see his role in East Africa community is to deal with the crisis that is in the East. Somalia also, It is another crisis, Mogadishu, that the East Africa community has to deal with. But like I'll say to you, it is a collective effort of the East Africa community leaders that must deal with their challenges come 2023.
Having touched on that US-Africa summit that was led by President Joe Biden, I mean, we had only about 49 out of the 54 states attending. Speak to us about that, especially when it comes to Zimbabwe and some of the sanctions, and how Africa really is working together with the West in terms of trying to get Africa out there, and most importantly having Africans benefit from their resources.
If you can look at Africa-US summit, it is said that there were commitments made, but some of the African scholars and leading diplomats are saying, but members of parliament were not there. The foreign policy committees were not there. And second is that there were there were 5 African countries who were not allowed to be in that summit, and we know it's Mali, Burkina Faso, Guinea-Conakry, Guinea-Bissau, Sudan. But when you look how African leaders sell their souls to Washington, you know, the Washington consensus on Africa is always a bad story. I feel that people like Biden, Obama, Bush, Bill Clinton, Trump, they've already trampled African governance system by promising Africa aid always. And you look at American intervention and interest in African conflicts. The conflict of Ethiopia, America has an interest there. Trade, America has an interest there. Climate change, America doesn't want to pay climate reparations. When we talk of even issues of AGOA, the trade relations, they are not balanced. They are not fair. So Americans have made sure that their foreign policy is always make us to beg. Hence, we have people who will always tell you about the ties that binds us, that America is a superpower. But if you look how they also try to even hoodwink African states in the conflict of Russia and Ukraine, many African countries show them actually that they can think on terms of diplomacy to say that we cannot be dragged into a war that we don't know of NATO and Ukraine. And that's how the U.S. foreign policy, as I was saying to you, and those sanctions, by the way, I always call them stupid sanctions, irrelevant sanctions, to sanction the family of Mnangagwa, to sanction the families of African presidents. That will not make change, but if you deal with the issues of reparations, and like I said to you, the foreign policy of the U.S. is always unfair towards Africa.
Yeah. And those sanctions on Zimbabwe, how much of an impact is that having on us as South Africans? No,
definitely you will have always African migrants coming in and out. You'll have always the high food price, the fuel, the load shedding that Zimbabwe it is going through. But Zimbabwe, interestingly, come 2023, they are going for the elections. But the Zimbabwe sanctions, let me hasten to say that the Pan-African Parliament also this year, they pushed for the eradication and abolishment of the Zimbabwean sanctions. Because if you look, U.S. is far from Zimbabwe, but they can impose sanctions. So you ask yourself, what kind of malice of Assad or mockery, or even the dilemma that they are bringing, because they made ordinary people to suffer. So for us in South Africa, the direct impact becomes on people's movement. It becomes on what I've raised earlier, commodities, things going high, and also how do you deal with the migration issue, which has been a serious concern.
You touched a little earlier on the Tigray and Ethiopian war, and this could by far be the worst war on the African continent in the last 2 years. I mean, with 600,000 lives lost, over 20 million facing famine, 20 million displaced, as well as scores of women and children that have been subjected to institutionalized rapes. In comparison to just over 6,000 that have died in the Ukrainian war and 15 million displaced in Ukraine, how is it that our focus is so much on Ukraine as opposed to what's devastating happening in Africa?
I will say those are the politics and the politics of humanitarian aid. And why the politics of humanitarian aid? The conflict that has been in the north part of Ethiopia, for your viewers' sake, I think this year I engaged Goli on it when the peace talks were about to start, and they were being pushed for another week. And those peace talks are important also. South Africa played a critical role. We were the host.
Yes.
And not only the host, we also provided secretarial support. We also provided the mediator. But if you look at what you are saying in terms of the balancing of humanitarian aid and access, The UN showed Africa a middle finger. It shows Africa that you are not a concern. And that's where, when you saw the Russian conflict and Ukraine started in February, but the Ethiopian conflict in November 2020. And we were seeking African solutions for that. And hence, I said to you, that peace process, as we are talking now, just during this week, the mediators were in Mekelle to do what we call verification and monitoring process. Ethiopian Airlines is flying now to the capital city of Mekelle. The banks are open. Humanitarian aid is there. So at least there is a hope. We are sealing 2022, the year of 2022, with a positive outcome of the peace process of Ethiopia, but we are still hanging with the DRC and Rwanda crisis.
We most certainly are, and still on that. I mean, we know, like you said, those peace talks were held on South African soil. And we also had former presidents Obasanjo and former President Kenyatta and former Deputy President Newzroom from South Africa, brokering those negotiations between these two regions. How important is it that we're able to solve our own problems in our own backyard and stop having the Western America bringing in, internationalizing our own domestic issues?
Interestingly, like I said to you earlier, the U.S. were the observers in these talks. It was AU-led, by the way. It was African Union peace talks. There were some secret talks that happened in Djibouti before. So South Africa became the second host. So what is important, I think, is that the peace agreement being drafted with an African ink, signed with an African hands, drafted in an African soil, not in a European soil. Now, the peace agreements that have been signed or the treaties that are there, it is important when the people can own them, Katlego. It is not just a feel-good moment of the ceremonial group pictures and signing in the high places. It is important to monitor and to bring stability in the Horn of Africa and in many conflict-ridden areas in Africa where you have conflicts and the peace processes. It is important also the negotiation skills. I know that people were worried about there were not gender balance. There were many males and men, what they will call patriarchy on politics of conflicts, when conflict and wars affect children and women. So I think what is important is that these mediation efforts should be given to the AU, South Africa also, but also it is important that the AU should not have been not clear about this peace process. Because like I said to you, the US was like pulling, because they were the ones who brought the TPLF delegates with their own craft to these peace talks. So if you can look at how foreign politics play out in our mediation processes, it is the game that African leaders, African mediators must be careful of.
And it was also the U.S. that wanted to impose sanctions and travel restrictions on Ethiopia and some of those Eritrean delegates.
Correct. Ethiopia has been signing wrong buttons. Even in Ethiopia during this war, they were claiming that there will be a coup, there will be a takeover of Addis Ababa. They did the same in South Africa by sending a panicking button that there will be a scare bomb in something. So the U.S. foreign policy and intelligence sometimes is lacking. It doesn't have context. It doesn't have content. So if sometimes we have to unmask it, we have to say, but the U.S. foreign policy in Africa is very suicidal.
Well, let's just hold it there for now. Advocate Sipho Mantula, as we're discussing Africa in the year of 2022. We'll be back with more with Advocate after the break. Welcome back. We continue our conversation with Advocate Sipho Mantula, who is the researcher at the Thabo Mbeki School of Public and Internalization. Now, Advocate, we were speaking earlier on about Tigray and Ethiopia, and the Eritrean troops are still occupying some parts of Tigray. Will we see them moving out anytime soon to ensure stability in that region?
You know, Katlego, funny enough is that the peace agreement, when I was reading that document, there is no Eritrean forces mentioned. But with my high insight, some of the elders have raised the role of Ethiopian forces being the negative force. But as we read the cables this week, also yesterday, some of them are moving out of Aksum and the Shirye region because they were there to guard their borders, as they have alleged before in 2020. But this issue of Eritrea in Tigray, it has been the cause of concern since the beginning of the war. So I think hopefully they will abide with the peace treaty that was signed on the 2nd of November in 2022 in this country.
Is there a reason why they were not a part of the negotiation talks?
Actually, they were not implicated. There was always a denial from the federal government that Eritrea is involved. Like I say, it's more of a secret and intelligence operation that you cannot divulge easily to say how Eritrea was involved, despite that there were facts that the UN was claiming, TPLF was claiming, but this was a war that affected even the neighboring countries when it started. So we need to know the after effects of conflicts, that whenever there are conflicts, neighboring countries will always bear the brunt.
Most certainly. Now, COP27 took place this year in November on African soil for the very first time. Was there a significance with that?
You know, Egypt COP27 is the same like what we had in South Africa, the climate change, but I think the major significance was the climate reparations that I've mentioned earlier, that many African countries, Nigeria, Cameroon, Senegal, Uganda, they were pushing for this climate change reparations that the polluters must pay. By the way, the issues of climate change, it's not all about the issues of weather patterns where you have floods, you have uncertain climatic weather conditions. It also goes to the polluters, who are the fossil fuel, the issues of carbon, the carbon emissions. How do we protect Mother Nature? And I think that's where many African countries, when they went to Cairo, they were going to remind African countries to say, when you look at the climate change, environmental law, environmental issues ought to remind you that Africa is also facing challenges. There were floods in many countries like DRC this year, Abuja, some parts even of South Africa experienced some floods. So if you can look at the issues of uncertain climate conditions, it is something that also has its politics. But the politics of it is where you put the funding. And that's where the Green Fund and the climate reparations, that was major highlights that came out of Cairo COP27.
But in moving away from fossil fuel, from using fossil fuel, is Africa that much of a contributor towards these carbon emissions as opposed to the rest of the globe?
One can say Africa is not, but Africa is facing multinationals and companies coming in. And Africa has many projects, the biodiesel. Africa has got the cannabis industry that they can look into if you are thinking of going green. Africa has got hydropower, the water issues. So Africa has got potential. But the question is that Africa has been used as a dumping continent for many things. If you look whether it's what we call the post-COVID situation, whether we are still in COVID or not, but you look at how COVID also affected the African governments, but also the issues of climate change, like I'm saying to you, there are some politics around it, and those politics are always to undermine Africa's potential, that Africa can still come out of it. The planting of trees is another way of dealing with climate change, and Ethiopia has been leading on that, Kenya has been leading on that. I don't think South Africa is even thinking of that planting of trees can deal with uncertain climate change. The heat wave that we see in Durban, the floods that we saw in KZN, in some parts of Gauteng, some parts of Northwest, those are the issues of environmental awareness, education. How do we instill education? And I think that's where African education-based system must deal with environmental awareness.
I mean, we have these COPs year on year, and policies and resolutions are made at every single COP. And arguments have been that, I mean, especially with this year's, that no new goals were set to make a means in terms of averting gas emissions. How should we then be moving into implementing that which we decide on at these COP conferences?
You know, what is quite difficult is that international summits, conferences, is that member states, they go there. I always call them developmental tourists. They don't bring those policies to their national policies. Hence, even when you see African governments, when they have to draft a policy on the environment, on health, they go to World Health Organization in Geneva, but when they come back, they've forgotten those documents in their hotels. Even if they have them on their iPads, they still cannot read and fathom and grasp. Why is it important when you are an international, you are a national delegate going to a conference to go and pick up knowledge and policies that can assist South Africa, and you just sit on it? And that's why I say to you, the issues of us having problem of water, problems of energy, the issues of electricity in this country, those are the issues that even climate change can deal with them. How do you deal with power cuts in the country? Because the more you have rain, is the more your infrastructure gets damaged. the issues of coal as well. How the Germans and the Americans and the Europeans try to, what I can call, coerce other African countries to deal away with the coal. And the issue of coal, as you know, is the politics of it. Others are bringing stones now. They're not bringing real coals.
Most certainly. And speaking on that issue of coal, I mean, South Africa's moving a lot of coal out to the UK. I mean, they've recently said they were creating one of their first coal mines that will focus on steel, but we do know that they have an energy crisis. Do you think that we could find ourselves in a crisis as South Africans with all the coal that we're moving out when moving towards the mixed energy system that we're trying to work towards?
The issue of mixed policy was there in government, but it was the issue of political will. It was the issue of understanding our nuclear that we have in Quebec, in Cape Town. Africa has got potential. You look at DRC Congo, the hydropower. You look at the conflict that was there between Sudan, Ethiopia, and Egypt on the Nile River. They've looked at the issue of mixed energy by looking at hydropower. Others, they will tell you of solar energy, but other aspects on energy sector will tell you about even that the solar is not connected to the grid. But the grid of electricity in Africa is coupled with greediness of corruption. So I always connect the grid with corruption.
Right.
That even if we fight to have our grid in many African countries connected and stable, is the question of corruption. Yes, you can have the mixed energy. You find two ministers in this country not talking the same language. They are in a different same WhatsApp group when they have to talk about energy crisis. And that's the problem of African leaders, African policymakers, that they don't look at agency and emergence of issues.
And I mean, at these conferences, it's not just leaders that are sitting there, it's civil society organizations, it's businesses. How important is it as communities for us to step up to the plate and have our voices heard, because it's our children down the line who will be impacted by these decisions?
Uganda, actually, the civil society in Uganda, there was one woman, I cannot recall her name, there was one Ugandan woman who was very vocal, passionate about COP27 on issues of climate reparations. But I think even children and our curriculum at school, they should go back to what we used to have, some of us. We used to call it conservation lengau club. In high schools, in primary schools, the issue of cleanness. When you look at our cities, they are not clean. Our president failed to adopt what is happening in Rwanda. The Uganda project. Every first Saturday of the month, they clean their city, their township, their villages. But President Ramaphosa tried to bring it in 2018, but he failed because the issue of cleanness. Now it's festive. You will see that townships, the cities, they can be clean for now, but the following week, there'll be dirtiness, and that environmental pollution, it causes health hazards.
We've seen a number of coups going on across Africa for a number of years in trying to take over countries. How do you think we're going to move, or will we ever move away from the culture of coups? You know, we can talk about coronavirus as epidemic. I call them the coup epidemics that started in Burkina Faso, beginning of the year. The coup that happened in Guinea-Conakry, attempted in Guinea-Conakry and Guinea-Bissau. The coup that happens are the issue of military appetite of power. I always call that the military generals. They have appetite for power, but they don't know the hour where they can rule. So you need civilian and military relation, but you need also democracy, African democracy principles. For military to leave the barracks and wanted to be in the government buildings, in the state house, it is a problem. And that's where when we saw the military coups that happened in Burkina Faso, twice of them, by the way. There was Damiba coming to power, removing Kabore. There was Traore coming to power, removing Damiba. There was Assimi Goïta in Mali. There was an attempt in Guinea-Bissau. There was an attempt in Sao Tome, Principe. There was an attempt, as we speak now, 2 weeks ago, in the Gambia, in Banjul. So the issue of military coups, there was an attempt in DRC. So the issues of the military coups in Africa, again, it shows that there is a lack and a deficit of leadership. There is an essence of where, and also the sentiments around France. Whenever there were these military coups, there was anger against the French embassy. You look at Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso, you look at Mali. So all these military coups, like I said to you, Katlego, it's a pity the African Charter on Election Democracy doesn't allow them. So they don't have any space, but they have also found their space in the democratization space. So military coups, I think, is something that we might have to live with. We might not want to run away from them, but we are living with them now.
I don't know whether Eswatini, Zimbabwe, South Africa will have military coups, but if you look at the nature of how we are dealing with the democracy, it also pushes the military. But also the military working conditions are also the push and the pull factors of this military coups.
You touched on France there, the exiting of the French on the African continent. What does it mean for Africans?
It means Africans must deal with their own issues now. When France left Mali, Burkina Faso from Operation Barkhane, they've been there for 7 years. What peace were they keeping? It's the same like the United Nations that has been in the DRC for 60 years, but there is still war happening. Now, the French military troops in the Sahel, we know very well, is for foreign policy issues, is for national interest issues, is for exploiting the natural resources of Africa. So the French hegemony, it comes even to a point where the currency that is being used in West Africa is still the francs. So Africa has still been colonized with the currency, still been colonized with the passports, that our passports are still written with French language, including South Africa, by the way. Our passports still have a French language. So the French hegemony in West Africa, it comes to a point where there is a need for West Africa countries to have their own standby force. But also this appetite of Russia and China coming in. Once France leave, Russia and China occupies the space. And
Russia and China has been making inroads within Africa. And that doesn't sit very well with the United States.
But they are part of the BRICS. I think, again, the international diplomacy reminds us that even if the U.S. claims that the Russia and the China presence in Africa is problematic, is negative, it is not. They are part of the BRICS countries. Remember that Russia and China, Brazil, India, and also Algeria is applying to become a BRICS member. So if you look at the role of China and Russia, is also the one which I call them a negative force, is to unmask the role of the West.
Right, moving more to some of the social celebrations that we had on the continent. We celebrated the centenary of Julius Nyerere. We know that he was one of the first to attend a university at Edinburgh, one of the first East African people to even be able to make the list of that alumni. What do you make of the celebrations of Julius Nyerere, especially as a leader in Africa?
You know, the centenary of Mwalimu Julius Kabarange Nyerere, it's important in South African context because he visited South Africa in 1997. He was part of the Burundi peace process. Julius Nyerere housed many of our liberation movements, the African National Congress, the Pan-Africanist Congress of Azanian People's Organization. So the role of Tanzania in the liberation of South Africa is very important. As we talk of Kwanzaa moments now, Julius Nyerere spoke about Ilima, Ujama. He spoke about cooperative economics. He spoke about African development, African economics. So if you have to look 100 years back, Julius Nyerere will not be happy with Africa borrowing money at the IMF. He will not have liked what he saw Nana Kofu going to IMF to borrow money. He will not be happy to see people like William Ruto going to the IMF to borrow money, because Julius Nyerere spoke about development of Africa. He spoke about cooperative economics, hence Ujama, Letsema, cooperative economics. That was the legacy of Julius Nyerere. And like I said to you, Julius Nyerere, Kenneth Kaunda, Samora Machel, they were the leaders of the frontline states.
Are we producing more of your Julius Nyereres, your Kenneth Kaundas, and what is it that our African leaders lack in having that tenacity and that fight that those leaders had? You know,
I think we are going that route because even last month, South Africa, as I was even remembering, they went on a culture season between Tanzania and South Africa, and there were scholars who were looking at the liberation routes, but I think the point that you are raising is on dealing with current challenges that faces Africa. Remember Tanzania during COVID-19, they were clear. The late President John Pombe Magufuli told the West to get off. Samia Suluhu, as the new president of Tanzania, dealt with the issues of women representation. But I think our relation with Tanzania must be on education, agriculture, diplomacy, and on issues that can assist us rather than the issue of Kiswahili language is coming from Tanzania. We say we want to introduce Kiswahili as one of our official African languages in our schools. So Tanzania plays that critical role. And like I said to you, they were our host. They were hosting most of our liberation movements.
Speaking on celebrating birthdays, Miriam Makeba on the 4th of March 2022 would have been 90 years old. Now, we know that she's a stalwart and iconic African liberation, and her identity, where she played as the leader for what Africa is to the rest of the world, can never be surpassed.
A cultural ambassador and emissary. You know, our institute, the Thabo Mbeki African School on Public and International Affairs, on the 4th of March, we had a celebration of the 90 years of Miriam Makeba, looking at the 9 decades on the 4th of March this year, with the likes of Bomme Abigail Kubeka, Bomme Maralo, Bomme Tunokwe, Boringo, and his family as well. But we look back at the life and times of Miriam Makeba, Kabore Selohalani, but we said, but Miriam Makeba, what was his impact on the continent in terms of his music, the conflicts that are happening in Africa? But I think, like we said, ultimately we said, Miriam Makeba was not honored in this country. He was not recognized enough. His IP rights are still contested. So the 9 decades of Miriam Makeba were the 9 decades of pain and suffering, but also of joy, because she gave us the music, she gave us the food, she gave us the attire. Like Mama Africa, I think one aspect about Miriam Makeba, it was her style of dress.
Of course.
Her lack of, I mean, she was, they say she would even like to cook. When Ringo was talking to her, she said, Miriam Makeba, when they will rehearse as a band, she will prepare the food for them. Metunokwe will explain how Miriam Makeba was angry with the government, how they were treating her. Memaralo spoke eloquently and lengthy about Miriam Makeba. So if you can look, Rehalani was worried about his IP rights. And I know if he's watching, he said to me, Sipho, I want to pursue my studies on the IP rights of our artists. So I think if you think of the intellectual property rights of Miriam Makeba and many more, Solomon Linda, Popoli, Mbobe, you look at Abometunok, many of the people who have been fighting for their intellectual property rights. Miriam Makeba becomes that embodiment and that symbol. And like I said to you, she was Mama Africa. She traveled many African countries, Europe. She had 9 diplomatic passports. I always joke, I said Mama Africa was a polyandrist. You know, she married 3 men, but not at the same time. Not undermining my elder, but Miriam, Stochika Michael, people like Brahu, Sokoture, I've mentioned, Harry Belafonte.
Yes.
So if you think of Miriam Makeba, you think of this encyclopedia of Mazi, of the mother of Africa.
She certainly was. And of course, we lost Ntate Don Matera on the 18th of July this year. I mean, we lost a poet, we lost an activist, and if you've ever met Ntate Don Matera, he tells it like it is.
Brazinga, he will always speak Tsotital, Don Matera, you know. And again, it even disturbs them Nelson Mandela Day, by the way. Come next year, 18 July, we will not think of Mandela Day, we'll think of Bradon. But I think Bradon, he lived his life. A great scholar, a journalist, a poet, an elder, a thinker as well. So I think Brazinga, Don Matera, people will know him from memory, his weapon. Azania love songs, if you want to read his poetry. Brazinga, it was said, because some of us we did interact with. And I know people like Bokhafela Wama Hohodi, Botato Wama Hohodi, and many more, Bolebo Mashile, they were inspired by Ntate Don Matera. So like we said, the year ended in a bad note. Even if we lost your Kwaito artist, you lost your people like Botokolo. We lost many of our artists this year, but I think Bradon stand as one of our elders that we should never forget in this country.
Well, certainly. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon, Advocate. You've been a wealth of knowledge, especially when it comes to the continent of Africa. And we hope that we will have more good stories that will come out of this continent in the year of 2023.
No, indeed, Kasef, we will have good stories come next year, January. Tomorrow is the South Sudan Independence Day, not South Sudan, not Sudan, Khartoum. And Comoros is taking the AU chairperson. So we'll always reflect on the African continent.
We most certainly will. That was Advocate Super Mantula telling us there about the roundup of Africa 2022.